So my talk today is going to be on global environmental issues, and the main points have to do with the major areas that were affecting our global environment. We'll talk about the roots, causes of the problems, how these are related to the roots of human behavior, and then some potential solutions. So our world would be very different if we had the impact that we've already had right now. And this is just the minimum ice cover on the Arctic ice cap here in 1980 as determined by NASA. And if you look up here around Devon Island, you can see that the ice essentially, even at the minimum, completely clogs to that point. And then if we go to the minimum in 2012, you see during the summer that all of this is open. Okay, so that means that if this was 300 years ago, there would be a Northwest Passage, right? And so the whole course of U.S. history would be different. Canada would probably be the superpower, not the United States, because they would control movement of materials from Europe to Asia, because every summer they could have moved stuff here. And this would be an extraordinarily strategically important area, militarily and trade-wise, as well as this one. Russia probably would have stayed more important. They certainly never would have given up Alaska in that particular case. So you can just imagine how different things would be if the globe is in a different place. So the key conflict we have here is that we do live in a finite world. And the picture that I showed, the first picture from space of Earth, led humanity to really realize that it is just a globe. And until then it seemed almost infinite, but it's not. And that the best predictor of prior human behavior is past behavior. And that past behavior in particular has been increasing our footprint on the Earth by using more resources and more resources. That hasn't changed with any of human history. We'll talk about that. So we have this basic conflict. We can't stay within those limits and keep behaving as we have in the past. And we add to that the scale of the problems. The global scale is so different than the local scale that sometimes we're not suited to deal with those, and it's also hard to see the scope of them. Another part of the philosophy that I have is, who do you believe when you come into these situations? Because you hear different people talk about what's important and what's not. And I think one of the major principles that's important is that the more somebody has to gain from you believing their point of view, the less likely you should hold them to be telling you the truth. It's interesting that people who are having the very largest negative effect on the global environment also have the most to gain from doing so. So it's something to keep in mind. So as I wrote this book and was talking to editors and stuff, they didn't want a gloom and doom another bad news story. Sort of the other side of it is an environmentalist talking about the raping and pillaging of Earth by the capitalistic society. What I think is really important is to use a scientific approach and a realistic approach versus wishful thinking and denial. So if the scientific facts show that there is gloom and doom, then that's the truth, and you can't just deny it because you don't want to believe it's true. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. Part of the problem is we're not evolved to deal with very large numbers. We've basically lived in small societies for all of our evolution, and even a global society hasn't really been much of a reality until perhaps I don't know, maybe Larry was in the first generation that really realized that they were in a global society, or me. And we're not adapted to deal with global degradation, either the time or the time scales or the sizes that we're talking about. And Jared Diamond has a book that he's written about failure of civilization called Collapse. And many past civilizations have failed because they've overexploited their local environment and combined with other factors, but it's been played into that. And when that happens, either that society just goes away or the people move elsewhere. But at this point, it's not local anymore because we're throughout the entire world. So if our civilization now fails or collapses, it's everybody that's involved, not just not just one group of people living on Easter Island or on the east coast of Greenland or some of the other examples that he gave. So a really large number. This is like, my wife is really annoyed by this figure. It's 10,000 dots. Just a matrix of 100 by 100 dots. And if you put 71 people in each one of those dots, then and then you take this whole thing and cram it into one of those dots and make another one of those. That's how many people there are on Earth, 7.1 billion people. And you really can't imagine, each one of these dots containing a whole one of these. But I mean, it's just the numbers are too big to think about. I mean, we're evolved to think of, like 1, 2, 3, 10, 20, maybe 100 or something like that. But, millions and billions are tough. But the reality is and these graphs I'm going to give you, when I can, I'm going to go over 200-year time frame. So the editor sort of asked me about revising this book, and I was like, well, I did put on a 200-year time frame, so 5 or 10 years shouldn't make much difference in my conclusions here. It's part of the momentum, right, the large time scales. And you can see, though, that the Earth's population, as you all know, has increased. And I started working on the book in about 2000, and between then and now, the Earth's population increased in absolute numbers about the same amount as it did in the first 120 years or so of this graph. So the rate of change that's happening, this exponential rate of change, is unprecedented in basically all of human history. And we can go through a bunch of different things that indicate our impact on the environment and how much resources we use. And this graph here from 1800 is the estimates of the amount of energy that's used in just equivalent metric tons of oil per person per year. And we see this increase up until the 50s, and we got a little bit more efficient, but it just keeps going up. That on average, as our standard of living goes up, as we use more and more technology, we use more energy. And you can think of horsepower, right? Horsepower being a car that you might drive, and you might have hundreds of horsepower in a car. Well, that was what a king would command 100 horses in 1400, right? No, the average person like us wouldn't have the ability to move 100 horses worth of stuff. Now you can go down to the rental store and get a truck that does that, right? So it's not a bad thing necessarily. It's just a whole different scale of energy use. But if we use, this is the number per person, if you multiply that times just the total number of people on Earth, you get basically an increase times an increase, and you get this incredible expansion where even from 1900 we've gone up 7, 8 times as much energy that's being used on Earth as there was historically. And these graphs then, you can also think of of economic activity as another indicator of how much resources we use. And this is just the individual output in $1990 per person, and we see that we've become a lot richer and on average across the entire globe. Right? Some people haven't, some people have. On average, we've become quite a bit richer. About $5,000 per year per person, which wouldn't be that much here, but on average, that's about what it is. But if you multiply that times the number of people, again, you get this explosion of economic activity and use of resources. The resource that maybe some people think might become limiting or we're closest to the limit of using is water. And this is just the global water use in cubic kilometers per year of all of humanity. And we see this vast increase. And the upper level is about half of what's readily available through the hydrologic cycle in places that we need it, at times that we need it. So we're up to about half of the total amount of water. If we use it all, then you got to start thinking about, well, what about the biodiversity, the fish? What about, and then there's also local aspects of this. Obviously, in dry areas like Arab countries, Israel, Northern Africa, there's a lot more pressure on water resources. Western United States, and so it's more intense in some places than others. Carbon dioxide has increased significantly. The surface of the Earth has increased significantly over the last 200 years. Early on, deforestation in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution sort of drove the CO2 starting to go up. But then as we deforested at more and more rapid rates and burned more and more fossil fuels, that rate of CO2 increase goes up. And this is pretty unprecedented under human history, much of human history. This is almost 1 million years worth of record. It's a combination of two things. The carbon dioxide is from cores drilled in the Antarctic ice sheet, and the little bubbles, atmospheric bubbles that are entrained in that. They can analyze how much carbon dioxide there was in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And nearby in the ocean, they can do cores of the ocean and looked at the marine life, and specifically foraminifera protozoa, which put down carbonate shells. And the isotopic signature of those is dependent upon the temperature in the ocean. So they can link what the ocean temperature, which has sort of averages the global temperature is, with what the CO2 is. And if you look at these two graphs, you can just see every time the CO2 goes up, the temperature goes up, right? There's just this really tight correlation over that amount of time. So there's this very close link between those. And since Arrhenius, several hundred years ago, figured out that carbon dioxide absorbed heat, and living in Scandinavia, he thought that we should put a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere so you could have better crops in Scandinavia, right, in warmer weather, because it's always cold up there. It's been known that there's this functional relationship between potential CO2 in the atmosphere and the temperature. And then just to put these variations over the last almost 1 million years of carbon dioxide in context, what we have today is up there in that red on the top of that graph. So I guess that's my equivalent to Al Gore's big lifter thing that he does in Inconvenient Truth. It's not just the average temperature increasing, but also it's a chemical fact that as you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, and then that dissolves in the water, ocean's water, that it lowers the pH. And when that pH lowers, organisms such as corals and these foraminiferas I talk about, and particularly the corals, can't build their shells anymore. They can't lay down calcium carbonate. And so it's one of the big biodiversity problems, and also that's one of the big areas where carbon is redeposited is in coral reefs. And so we'll have a very big change in the ecology of the oceans, just unrelated to the temperature. The temperature is also harming the corals, but the CO2. There's also there's some ideas for some runaway catastrophic effects of greenhouse warming. And this includes the fact that as we warm up, the permafrost starts to melt, and tremendous amounts of carbon have been stored in the soils in the northern hemispheres, in both Russia and Canada. And that carbon has been deposited over literally millions of years, yet if it warms, it all becomes available for the microbes to use, and they blow off methane, which is a very strong greenhouse gas, and carbon dioxide. And if they do that, then that causes a runaway effect because it warms the planet more, which thaws more permafrost, which increases their rates, and we get this feedback. Related to that, if you get a warmer and warmer water, it holds less oxygen. And if the lower part of the ocean, basically below where storms can mix it, goes anoxic, it loses its oxygen, then the biogeochemistry changes completely. And the processes that generate nitrous oxide and methane tend to increase. In addition to the big loss of biodiversity, of deep sea biodiversity, which we mostly don't see, but there's a lot of animals and organisms that live down there. And then there's also a lot of methane that's stored as methane ice under the shallow continental shelf. And it's under high pressure, so it's under a solid in that. But as that pressure decreases or the temperature increases, it's able to come out as a gas. And if we warm up the oceans enough, that could come out into the atmosphere and cause this runaway effect to occur as well. So there's these, while we know that there's global warming and that CO2 increases, And we actually know how much acidification this will cost and roughly what this will cost as far as corals. We don't know exactly where these runaway effects are going to happen, so that's a little bit more difficult to predict. But they would be so catastrophic that if they do, it's a real problem. One of the sort of triumphs, I guess, of global environmental issues is controlling chlorofluorocarbon releases that were used as propellants in aerosol cans and refrigerants for air conditioning. And by the 1990s, people realized that there were these large holes in the ozone that keeps the ultraviolet radiation from coming in and striking the Earth's planet that were forming around the poles, and that those were in danger of spreading across the entire world. And if they did so, basically, human civilization wouldn't be able to keep going because you couldn't grow crops, and there would be we wouldn't be able to do well. In spite of Ronald Reagan at the time saying we should wear hats and sunscreen, I think that was his response to that. Some of you in the room may remember that particular statement. So there's the Montreal Protocol, and we had this global agreement to stop producing chlorofluorocarbons and releasing them into the atmosphere. And we see that about maybe 20 years after that, the size of the ozone hole stopped increasing so much. And now, when we talk about 25 or more years, we're not even back down to where we were in the 1990s when we shut it off. So this is part of that momentum, right? You have a problem, it's a dire problem, you stop it. We have a global problem, it takes a long time for the Earth to essentially rebound from that. So we're talking about CO2. If we cut off CO2 right now, it would take maybe 50, 100 years at least for things to drop down substantially. All these global problems have a big momentum. A similar momentum that I hadn't talked about yet, but is in population growth. So even if we went right to replacement fertility right now, the population would still keep going up because human population has momentum. China had their one-child policy, and just now their growth is slowing 40, 50 years ago, because when they instituted that policy, all those little kids now have grown up and had their own children and continue to grow the population. So there's lots of momentum in these global problems. And with all these people, we have to feed them. So the area of cropland from now, this actually we're going back to 1700 to the present, has come up substantially, probably 2 or 3 times. And we've pretty much gotten in most of the really easily used cropland. And the amount of cropland per person, though, because the number of people has come up so much, has dropped substantially, and that's because of the green revolution, that we're able to produce much more crop per unit area because of the added fertilizers and pesticides and such. So there's a couple of issues that this raises. One is, how do we feed the additional people that are still coming, at number one, and number two, as standard of living goes up, people demand more protein, which basically means you need more crop area to produce a set amount of food. And so the demand for food is going to continue to go way up. I just read in National Geographic, they think that the largest global environmental impact is agriculture. And part of this is because we fertilize the land, and this is just now since from 1960, we see these big increases in the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus we're dumping onto the land to make the plants grow. We've doubled the amount of nitrogen that naturally came into these systems. Phosphorus is actually a non-renewable resource, so once we mine that away, it's going to be difficult to keep that going. But these pollutants then, they're good when they're on the cropland, but when they move away from the cropland, they basically fertilize growth of unwanted algae. And we have these algal blooms. We just had one in the Great Lakes that Ohio had to shut down their drinking water for days, and we have them in Kansas. We have lakes that are, Milford Lake was shut down, for example, and drinking water lakes are shut down. And the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, perhaps you've heard of this large area from fertilizing from the Midwest. But these dead zones are occurring all over the world. We're not the only place that has them. That's just the ones that we hear about. And as we try to increase our production, we need to get rid of the pests, the insect pests, and the weeds, and so we dump more and more pesticides on the land to make that happen, and we start seeing some sort of unwanted effects with that. That is, we see pesticide pollution spreading throughout the globe, and you can go to sample whales in the middle of the ocean and find pesticides in them, in their fat. You can go to fish in the high Arctic and find pesticides that have been moved through the atmosphere and concentrated in the food web there. So we're moving this stuff around the entire planet. One other thing that people don't know about so much, and maybe the species invasions they know, because we're moving so much stuff around so frequently, we're moving animals and plants everywhere, and we're basically homogenizing the biological characteristics of the different places. So basically we're going to end up with a bunch of rats and weeds. That's because they do well with they do well with humanity. They're essentially we're good for them. We're not good for a lot of other species. So in addition, as we alter the genetics of organisms, that also moves throughout the planet, and particularly in the microbial side of things, because bacteria can swap genes with each other. Different strains or species of bacteria can swap genes with each other. So you can go out into the ocean, middle of the ocean now, and isolate bacteria that have resistance to antibiotics that humans make and they've never experienced in their lives. Yet that resistance to that antibiotic is spread throughout the microbial populations globally. So this is something to keep in mind as we alter the genetics of things, particularly microbes, what the ultimate consequences of those are. And we do know one thing from, maybe starting with the entomologists and the pests that came in and the weed scientists, is that they don't really talk, with an initial invasion they talk about eradication, but once something's established it doesn't go away, right? So they just they talk more about controlling these insect pests as they come into the country. But the same process is ecologically true regardless of what we're talking about, whether we're talking about microbes or weeds or animals or diseases that come in. So in the younger people in this room, in their life, half of all species on Earth will be lost. It's a 6th great extinction in the history of the Earth of the 6.5 billion years ago. Actually, there's this report that came out that said half of all wildlife is just gone. Not half of all species, but half of all the total number of animals on Earth that's gone, because we fish them out of the oceans, we harvest them out of the sea. And we went on the ocean, and we harvest them off land, and then we replace them with livestock on land. So that's not, domestics have gone way up. This is mostly going to be due to loss of tropical rainforests at one of the epicenters of biodiversity, which is still going on, deforestation, acidification of the ocean, which I already spoke about, and the loss of corals. And this is based on very well-known ecological principles that if you have a smaller area, it will support less species. And so if you just reduce the area of those habitats, that's the prediction of how many species will be left. You may or may not care about this. It depends on whether you think that species other than humans have rights to exist or not. And that's a moral question. But it's a reality nonetheless. Okay, so now we're going to get into the human behavior part of things. We are in a new world. The fastest we can change is over hundreds of years. So there are some evolutionary changes that have taken root relatively quickly over evolutionary time, like the ability to use lactose for some of the northern European populations, so you can live on milk and cheese and things like that, which isn't necessarily part of the ancient human lineage. But things are happening much, much more quickly than that. Technology has way outpaced the ability of humans to adapt to global environment. And given that finite world, there's only one of the things has to change. Either our prior behavior patterns or the world has to be less finite. And you can't change the finite nature of Earth, right? So there's only really one option there. So how do we control the behaviors, and what are those behaviors that we're talking about? We can think of behavior on two axes. One of increasing biological relevance to survival, being hardwired. And the other part of behavior being cultural influences. And how those play off against each other determines sort of in aggregate how humanity acts. And at the most basic level, animals and plants need to reproduce and survive, right? That's just the ultimate drive. So you can think of that reproduction. You can imagine, you kind of have two options of controlling the consequences of behavior. You can tell young people, don't have sex, or you can tell them, use birth control, right? And which of these do you think is going to work? Because the drive is to have sex. It's difficult for people to avoid that fundamental biological reality of what they've become as animals. And I mean, it's just like telling a dog you can't have sex, right? I mean, if they're in heat, they're in heat. That's the way it is. Or keep yourself alive. Don't step in front of a truck, right? That's it. All these, be comfortable, get good food. All those things are things that you're driven to do by your hardwired. Then we move up this to things that become more cultural. So promotion of family and kin, that's probably fairly hardwired. That is, we know that we have this much stronger attachment to people in our family or people we're close to. If somebody in your family dies, it's devastating. There's people dying all over the world all the time for unjust reasons, and it doesn't really, we know it here in our brains, but it doesn't have that same emotional effect on us. It's something deep. If somebody very sort of loved one dies, it's like a physical blow to your body, right? I mean, there's something really, really in there. And other animals have that too, that, their animals take care of their offspring, siblings take care of each other. Chimpanzees have social groups, and they protect themselves against outside members. Even fish and things like that do. So it's still, parts of it are genetically hardwired. And then as we move up into things like interactions among communities, whether you cooperate, if you have wars, sports, things like that. And then these global interactions where we would cooperate on a global level. One of the sort of big problems here is that all of these interactions of cooperation up to this point are based on a sort of an us against them. That is, making our family survive against the other families, our village resisting the attacks of the other village. Our country cooperating with another country and not that to make us better, but it's always us against them. But we live in a global society now, so us against them kind of loses its reality. Okay, so I talked about this: reproduce. We want to control our physical environment. We want to cooperate with closely related individuals. And there's this, I'm going to talk about this more and about punishment, how you enforce cooperation. It's innate. And this one that's sort of confused me a little bit. The idea is, why do people need so much stuff? Why do we need so much wealth? What exactly is it that's driving us to do that? And my general idea of this is it's related to it's a secondary sexual characteristic, that wealth and power increases your ability to reproduce, and so and wealth and power essentially attract mates. So it is sort of a hardwired thing to just have a lot of stuff. It also could be hoarding is important for the bad times. That's another thing, that you store stuff so you can do bad. But our resources in this country, we use a lot more than we need to survive, for sure. The Pew Foundation surveys the U.S. population and has done so for the last 30 years or so. And they have these percentage of respondents that are in high income, medium income, and low income. And they ask these respondents, broken down by high, medium, and low income, how happy they are. And the rich people tend to say they're happier than the poor people, right? So you could argue, well, we should all be richer because we'd all be happier. Well, it's not really the way that it works, because if we look at wealth as it's changed since 1970 to 2000, it's expanded tremendously. And the richest people, right, now in 1970 are less rich than the middle were here. Yet these guys aren't getting happier. Nobody's getting happier because they're getting richer. They're only happier because they're richer than other people, not because they're richer. So there's this fundamental level of survival and having the basic things, but after that, the wealth gives you happiness because you have more than somebody else, which is not necessarily a God-given right, life pursuit of happiness, or a constitutional right, or whatever you want. So that sort of speaks to the moral side of things, whether people should be allowed to use as much resources as they want or not. So game theory is the idea that economists and behavioralists have looked at different aspects of human behavior, and the most basic one being the tragedy of commons. You have a limited resource, and you better use it quick before everyone else does, or you just get less, right? Cows on a pasture, they're overgrazing. You just put more cows on and get as much as you can off of it. That's very straightforward. There's some more detailed games, Ultimatum game, and the public goods game, which talk more about cooperation and how you enforce cooperation. The first of these being the Ultimatum game. These two players don't know each other, and it only happens once, right? The game is only going to happen once. You offer player A $100, and the player A can offer B however much of that they want. And if player B accepts that, then they both keep it. If player B rejects it, then they both lose all of it, right? And when they do this, in general, about $20 goes to player B, and much less than $20, and player B says, screw it, neither of us get any of it, right? So the logical way to play this game from player B's point of view is no matter how much you get, unless you get nothing, you should just take it, because you're only going to play the game once. And something's better than nothing, right? And it shouldn't matter how much somebody else gets, it's just how much you get, right? But we're hardwired, basically, to recognize unfairness and punish cheaters. And so at some point, that $20, okay, I'll take the $20, and that selfish bastard can keep the 80. And even chimpanzees have an equivalent of this game they run, and they do the same kind of, they perceive unfairness in reward, and they get upset about it. And they've done this all over the world. It works almost everywhere, except for there's a tribe in New Guinea where if you accept a gift, you're expected to reciprocate double. And so if people don't, it's a small enough community that they think, well, maybe I'm going to run into this guy again, and if I do, I'm going to have to pay him twice, and I can't pay him twice, so forget it, I won't take it. So they almost always refuse any offer at all in that particular example. But it seems to be a global aspect of humanity. And then there's another way to do this, and this is a repeated game. Instead of just playing it once, this is the public good games. And so everybody starts the same amount of money, then you put money into a pot, and then the pot gets doubled, and you divide it all up. And so you can think of some different ways to do this. And the first one here being an equal investment. Everybody puts everything in they have, all their chips into the pot. They get doubled, and they come back with twice what they put in, right? That seems like a good deal. But let's say only one of them decides to cheat. So one of them, basically, Chris in this example, doesn't put any chips in. Everyone else puts all their chips in. Then they take it in half, they split that all up again, and all of a sudden Chris does way better than everyone else, right? So when you cheat in this example, in this game, you do better. And when they play this game repeatedly, eventually people get to the point where they'll throw a chip or two in because they know they're going to lose. They don't want to seem like bad sports, but they realize that they're going to come behind if they keep putting a bunch of money into this thing. But what they can do then is put in rules such that you can, if somebody doesn't put in enough, you can basically fine them for one chip. You can take 3 of their chips and both of them just get thrown out of the game. And when they do that, then people start not competing so much and cooperating a little bit more. So we have this idea that if you view a situation as being unfair, as globally people will take some level of punishment and try to get people to cooperate. And this is what we in part refer to as a social norm, where the fear of punishment leads to cooperation. And there's some good examples of this. Smoking inside, now nobody smokes in anybody's house. When I was a kid, people would walk in and light up no matter where they were. But now the social norm is not to do that. When I was a kid, people would throw their McDonald's bags out the window on the highway, and littering was just what people did. And then there were laws. They didn't. But then they started enforcing the laws, and it got unpopular, and people don't do it so much anymore. wealthy women don't, in the United States at least, don't tend to wear furs because socially it's not so acceptable, right? It's just, so sometimes you can basically say, you can establish this social norm. To do this, people need to know what's at stake, and they need to be willing to punish those who use more than their share. So that means the average person on Earth needs to realize that there's this global resource out there, the Earth, and her ecosystem services that are providing for us, and that if somebody else uses up that finite resource that perhaps belongs to all of us, then maybe they're cheating and taking more of their share. And if they realize that, then they will be willing to punish that person even at some cost to themselves. And specifically, the calculus is made that people view a situation, and if they think they're not going to get caught, and they think the punishment's not too high, they'll take advantage anyway. So you always have to gauge what the benefits are to the individual cheater versus the punishment, and then the overall cost of putting that punishment in. And that's, you know, they're saints. There are suicide bombers that will give it all up for their cause. But on average, if you think about all the people on Earth, this is what we're talking about, just how the average person reacts to things. And this is the reality of how they do. There's a little bit more. We can actually put a value on the Earth's ecosystem services. We can assign monetary value to the Earth's capacity to support us, to provide us clean water, clean air, and all those things. And a cost to replace that, how much people are willing to pay for that. We can use polling to determine how much people value a resource. That is, how much you value having a park out there, how much you value having a healthy air to breathe versus, you know, having a chance of getting disease, those kinds of things. And we can use tools such as advertising to alter social norms and people's behavior. So back to that litter, or back to anti-smoking campaigns, some of those things. There have actually been some very effective public advertisement things that have kind of changed behaviors. And the smoking rates have actually gone down because the advertisement has convinced people that the cost to smoking or secondhand smoke, like cancer, is greater than the benefits, feeling good because you have that cigarette, or looking sexy because you're the Marlboro Man or whatever. So one of the issues that you kind of come up against, so education, you know, has its benefits, but that's a benefit if everybody agrees to what the basic facts are. And we have these situations of the global environmental issues, such as global warming and the greenhouse effect, and scientists are saying, here's the way it is, and people are saying, no, I don't believe that. You know, it's not true. And there's a couple reasons why this might happen. One of these is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is the idea that the less skilled you are, the more you tend to overestimate your skill. And the opposite is true. The more skilled you are, the more you tend to underestimate your skill. So the scientists sort of tend to say, well, this is the way the world works. But I might be wrong because there's a 2% chance, you know, and then they go into all their, whereas, you know, the Fox News commentator is absolutely sure they're an expert on global climate change, even though they have no training whatsoever in it, right? They're convinced that they know the answer, right? And so this is part of it. And in addition, there's this idea that people sort of have two ways to approach the world. One is you have a worldview, and if the facts do not agree with that worldview, then they can't be true. And that's a good way to filter out false information, because if everything is correct, then, and something doesn't quite agree with it, it's probably not right. The scientific approach, if you have a worldview and strong fact comes along that negates that worldview, you change your worldview to accommodate that. So basically all the science is set up to get around confirmation bias. The problem is that if you will not change your worldview regardless of the facts, then there's no way for scientific fact to work and for reality to change your behavior. Now there's research that suggests that conservative people tend to be more of the worldview, not accepting facts point of view, But it's all a gray area. It's a continuum, because when it comes down to it, and if a doctor tells them, take this pill or you're going to die, all of a sudden the facts seem to, like actually sink in. So I think we all sort of balance off against these. And scientists always have to be guarding against this confirmation bias as well. So it's not a black and white, but it's a gradient. But it plays into why the science doesn't necessarily get to play. And then the last one is this backfire effect, where people tend to harden their positions when they're showing data against those positions. And this is basically just sort of this response, oh, that can't be right, and then you'll. And so I mean, maybe that explains like the NRA or something. I don't know. Okay, so the last point I want to make is that to deal with these global environmental issues, this idea of consilience is something that E.O. Wilson's come up with, this coming together of knowledge. That for the really big problems, you can't just have a scientist, you can't just have an economist, you can't just have an educator. You need all these things. You need to know the economics. Most people on Earth decide what's right or wrong, as their code is in religion. And so if religion has global preservation as part of it, if the Pope's talking about sustainability, we're in better shape than if he's not. And many other approaches. So one of the things that we need is sort of this multidisciplinary approach to environmental issues. And the NRES program actually acknowledges that specifically in the way that it's built. The other one is this peculiar thing where we're now, at least in the United States and other parts of the corporations have a lot of legal standing and a lot of power, right? So why is it that something that's sort of on paper and not really a real thing has more power and more legal standing than the actual environment that supports us? It just doesn't make logical sense to me. So this is the ultimate game, if you want to think back to game theory. There's not us and them, we're all us. We all have this global environment that we depend upon for our very survival. There are cheaters that will take advantage of it if they can. But if we, as a society, use all these different things to guide the entire society towards minimizing those that take more than their share and maximizing the good for all of us, there's a chance that we could actually sustainably inhabit our planet. And that's the end. Looks like we have a minute or two for some questions if anybody's interested. Yes?
How do we get this global environment needs the same legal standing as corporations? How do we do that?
How do we get the global environment needs the same standing as corporations? Well, I mean, that's where the politics part of the consilience plays in. It's clearly a political issue. And if enough people start feeling that that's true and work towards that, then it could happen. And the reason I say that is because if you just talk about protecting the environment, right, and water quality, it always comes back to, well, what does it do for us, or the air quality or something like that. As opposed to something like protecting endangered species, which is actually a moral decision. Do we protect the planet as a whole? Because and people feel that we should protect species, and they feel that all over the world. I mean, when I was in Panama, there's frogs going extinct, and people are really worked up about it, right? That they don't, they feel that there's some sort of innate part of our heritage that should be there. So, yeah, it's a difficult political sell, but.
Is the ozone issue the greatest success we've had as a world effort to address an environmental problem?
I think the ozone is the greatest success we've had to address an environmental problem, except for the fact that there's a byproduct of nitrogen fertilization, nitrous oxide, which is known as laughing gas, but this part is not funny. When it goes up into the atmosphere, it also destroys ozone, and as we put more and more fertilizer on the fields and it runs off into aquatic environments, more nitrous oxide goes up. So it turns out that the actual ozone over most of the Earth, the tropical areas and the mid-latitudes, is actually decreasing now over time because we're putting off more nitrous oxide through human activities. So it's a success, but it's not a battle that's completely won yet either.
So that's a different problem than we had the agreement on to solve.
Yeah, right. The problem's the same, but the causes are slightly different and the solutions are different than the ozone, than the Montreal Protocol that stopped chlorofluorocarbon inputs and most chlorofluorocarbon inputs into the atmosphere. Yeah.
You had mentioned that, I think you said National Geographic said that the biggest impact to our world is our agriculture. Do you believe, what do you believe that we need to do that's different? Do we have only organic and just stop utilizing artificial fertilizing, or?
Right, so the question is how would we mitigate some of the negative environmental impacts of agriculture? And it's a huge issue because we do need to feed humanity. I mean, we can't just cut off the food, right? Yeah, well, a lot of those impacts have to do with loss of sediments, and so so best management practices are fairly well developed to do that. Maybe in some places, less fertilizer and less pesticide use, or at least management practices that minimize the amounts that are used and the amounts that leaves the environment. Ways to get around marginal lands. If possible, increase yields was going to be really important, and people are trying. It's not clear whether we'll be able to increase yields as much through breeding and such as we did to get to this point of the Green Revolution. I think that's one of the biggest open questions. Decrease the amount of energy that we use to put in. Decrease food waste and losses to pests. All of those things would have to feed into it. But yeah, it's a pretty complex issue.
How many people have read the Ghost Map, which is the university read? The Ghost Map?
That's supposedly the whole community is going to read that book, and it's about cholera and the worst outbreak in London, which occurred in Soho. And the author, Stephen Johnson, addresses the issue of cities and how creatures try not to defecate in their own bed, and what it means to use your water source to deal with polluting the rivers and getting rid of the stuff in your proximity. So when I was a child, my father was in the Air Force and we went to Japan. And they warned us that when we first got off the plane, we would smell something bad. It was fertilizer. They had the honey bucket man, and they collected from each house the excrement, put it in a big pit, and they spread it on their crops. I think a lot of the solutions, well, of course, all the solutions are within our own hands. And the author of the Ghost Map thinks that it's wonderful to live in big cities and that we should continue to do this. And I really question the wisdom of that. And as we deal with each of these problems, I think we have to start withdrawing our energy from some corporate ideas and taking more of an active role. I'm leaving that in a very abstract way. I'm not saying, okay, everybody now, although I think, what's his name? Derek Jensen. Are you familiar with the writer Derek Jensen? Okay, well, he's a very boots-on-the-ground environmentalist. He began to go out and poop in his own yard just so he would understand how long it would take for it to break down. And, that's not what I'm advocating, but I think we all can look at our consumption and decide, maybe go ahead and have a bumper sticker that says, "Don't eat beef." Mm-hmm. Whatever you think is good for all of us.
Yeah. Oh, well, I guess we're probably done with the class period.
So I apologize, Walter, but we are out of time. I'm sure if you've got some other questions or comments for Dr. Dodds, we do have a few minutes here. I'm sure he'd be willing to entertain those, but there is another class that's coming in. Let's thank Dr. Dodds for his presentation.
Thank you very much.